Hey, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here with Raven Connolly, a super fascinating, interesting philosopher queen at one time. That's when I first got exposed to you. Onto the Stoa. Saw a couple of really interesting, I know that you've been interesting reflection on Game B lately. See you pop up in all sorts of different elements. And I've always been like, hey, I got to get her on the show. And I want to talk about sex and death and whatever. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Gregg. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be invited.
So absolutely. So, I am a clinician. And so what I do is I invite people, my natural tendency and try to get to know people's narrative. And we're in this weird space together, you and I, in this weird meta-modern culture. People kind of know my story about how I wandered into here. Maybe you can share a little bit, at whatever level of depth or breadth you want to give, but just to help listeners kind of situate your place in the space. What's the story that kind of got you here, or key features that you might want to help situate?
Yeah. Well, key features. So before COVID world, I was already immersed in the podcast ecosystem around, what did Peter call it? It was like Intellectual Explorers Club.
Oh yeah. Hey, I got invited to that. I was on that.
I listened to a few of those episodes. Honestly, the name kind of put me off, which Peter did discover. He was like, oh, that's such a dweeby name. I was like too cool for that. I was listening to the Emerge podcast.
Ah, of course.
Daniel Thorson.
Hey, I love that podcast, actually.
Oh my God.
I was so disappointed that, and I was right to be set up to get on that podcast. So that was my life career goal. After getting a full professor, I wanted to be on Emerge, and then he disconnected it. So anyway, I never got my dream.
Major respect to that. I think people who really define their experience online and do what they want, I have a lot of respect for that. It's so easy to want to appease your fans.
That was, I will say, that's really funny because that's just actually hitting me. The Emerge podcast was by far one of the central pieces that walked me into this meta-modern space. Totally. It was, I'm going to listen to probably 4 out of every 5 of those episodes regularly.
Oh yeah.
Regular walk. They were great. So anyway, that's nice. We share that.
Yeah, no, we share beautiful. That. I think, I think that was a major Schelling point for lots of people in this space. And kind of seeded a lot of the conceptual frameworks and like sense-making tools that made COVID much more legible once it started to happen, and kind of gave us a path for finding each other at the Stoa and at other types of kind of digital campfires that emerged. But yeah, so I was listening to Emerge a lot. I was following Daniel Schmachtenberger and the Game B folks. And the other thing about my history is I went to the Evergreen State College and studied under Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang for years.
No shit, I didn't know that at all. Oh my God, what an interesting connection that is. Holy good Lord.
Very bizarre situation. So, and I grew up in Olympia, so there was all this weirdness. And then, I had friends from class there who were in the rationalist community, and the rationalist community is all, effective altruism and less wrong. And they're, connected to Qualia Research Institute and all of these other kind of consciousness and, world saving institutions. And so I was also connected to that community through personal relationships that I had. So they've ended up fusing in the last few years in a tremendous way. And then I was also introduced to Justin Murphy and his kind of digital ecosystem, IndieThinkers.
I've heard a little bit about that. I'm interested in learning more about that. So you have some connection with her? Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. I was involved in the first courses that he was doing online, and his first courses were with Johannes Schneiderhauser, who's got his own kind of digital university emerging. And so I was kind of early in all of that stuff. I've been pretty anti-institutional. I went to Evergreen,
just say no more.
I know, say no more. I was anti-institutional. I was just born an anti-authoritarian.
You're not a conservative Republican, Raven? I got to update my biography of you.
Oh my gosh. So very much an anti, like, kind of very critical of institutions, very strange kind of upbringing. Both my parents were like the black sheeps of their family, like totally going rogue, kind of adopting a sort of hippie culture. And that, I think, kind of that primed me for having an ear to the ground when all of this stuff really started emerging in the digital ecosystems. And I was obsessed with podcasts. I would listen to them all the time. It was like insane. It was a problem. Like super fixated, like just extraordinarily fixated. Couldn't think about anything else besides what I was learning. And it kind of, I mean, it sounds kind of like what you've talked about.
If you want to talk obsession, I'll talk about my UTOK obsession. It runs pretty deep, Raven.
It's just totally out of it. Like, couldn't talk about anything else. Just like, immersed in this like conceptual landscape, and aesthetic landscape. I had, a moment with this book called Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton, and that was like my exposure into philosophy, into Heidegger, and like into all of this kind of working with the conceptual frameworks that inform our cultural patterns, and trying to think of and conceive of new grammar, essentially, for interacting with things in the world. So hyperobjects was huge for me. And then I really feel like, I mean, that word is just used casually in these groups.
Yes, it's a part of the lexicon, climate change is a hyperobject, of course.
Like, internet is a hyperobject.
Obviously,
like,
everyone knows
planet
that.
is a hyperobject, so, and like Complexity Institute, whatever. I mean, we all know these things. Like, it's not, I have that background in terms of the interests. So I was really ready. I was really, really ready for something like the Stoa when it emerged. I was kind of starting.
Actually, I'll just pause for a second. So changing the grammar of the culture, talking with Gregg is very much about changing the grammar of the culture. So I just need to hear that phrase and be like, yes, indeed. We fundamentally need to upgrade the grammar of our culture. So I just need
I think grammar is an important way of understanding it, because there's only a small subset of people who are really interested in in the structures of things in an explicit way. You got to be kind of a weird nerd person to be like, how are these models functioning? Like, how do we figure out, a sequence, a hierarchical kind of integrated structure so that we can think through things? But, we have those things implicitly in our culture already. And that is the grammatical structure. Like, we don't think often about the grammatical structure of language. It just is a formalization in order for us to be legible to each other. I think the same thing can be said for how we understand the flows of governance and other types of interaction. And so making it conscious and being like, okay, now we're really thinking about structure consciously and trying to investigate how to organize these systems of thought, so that we can actually kind of make them implicit again. But once we've actually come to an explicit understanding of it, and I mean, I don't know what will happen to this community in the future, but I think that, part of the reason why I think the GameB video is significant, and regardless of its content, is that it shows a kind of movement towards a implicit expression of these explicit grammars. And while the video itself is very explicit about that, it's called Initiation into Game B. I think that there is a potential for people to embrace the expression of this new grammatical structure in implicit form. And I think that that's where we can begin to get into a new artistic movement. I mean, like for me and for my friends, like there's a lot of different people who are involved in these communities with lots of different talents. And I think that, metamodernism, for example, started as like a kind of artistic literature.
Totally.
Movement, right? Yeah, so totally. I think that there's a lot more to this community. Like, this is a long-term project, decade, that people are going to be influenced by this. And that the grammar that is explicit now, that we're working on now in terms of mapping everything and trying to figure out how everything fits together, will kind of sublimate and become, and I feel it in myself. It's just like I've sucked it up like a sponge. And it's now just like a value structure and a way of operating in a much more fluid way that then allows for whatever I'm touching or experiencing to have that underlying structure without me consciously having to think about it. It does take that like years of like working with material to shift your operating system to like become familiar with the grammar that you weren't immersed in throughout the other parts of your life. So there's a kind of you make it explicit and then it goes back down again, and then you can play in a different kind of environment. But anyways, that's kind of
beautiful.
That's another part of the journey.
Okay, so yeah, I love that. I love the reflections about the grammar. I mean, UTOK is then buried in a particular academic argument about this, but the larger cultural awakening and conscious evolution about that grammar and how to make it explicit and then turn it back into implicit. I've kind of got two questions for you. One will follow that line. We'll come back to the other about the Stoa, but were there things about that you saw in the grammar or things that you wanted to make explicit or things that really resonated at the very center for you in relationship to this journey about the kinds of things we wanted to transform around or become aware around, or central messages that were close to your heart in relationship to these issues?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I was raised by a environmental activist. So I have an interesting history, I would say, with some of the more kind of activist class concerns, both, feminism and gender theory and environmentalism, where my mom was already involved in those things when in the 80s.
Were people alive back then? Oh, wait.
I know,
some of us
right?
were.
Oh my God. She always was reminding me, like, I was cool in the 80s. Oh my God. I had a nose piercing, but no one had a nose piercing. I'm like, okay, Mom, cool.
I was a dork with a bowl cut, but let's not go there.
I once had a bowl cut, so I can empathize with that. Growing up in that environment, I like a lot of the things that I see now that are, I think, much more kind of almost extreme because of the digital medium that we live in, kind of exaggerating a lot of the pre-existing characteristics and propensities in the culture. I was raised with these things. Like, I was raised with an idea that there was going to be droughts and that there was going to be environmental catastrophe and that we needed to prepare and then we needed to save the world. And I was also raised with like gender neutral kind of ideology and very strong like feminist ideology. And that was also grammatical. Like, it wasn't something where my mom was like handing me like Andrea Dworkin or something, but it was just in the way that she operated in the world, and the way that she just kind of communicated with me and the way that she parented me and my brother. And so in a way, when I got to college and this stuff was going on, it was kind of like there was parts of me that had an affinity for it because it had been kind of primed in me, but it was also like not as cool, because it was like I already kind of knew it and I already kind of was like,
you weren't like getting enlightened to it in a particular way.
No, it was more like, oh, other people are finding this out, like maybe I should be friends with those people. And then I would kind of get close and I'd be like, no, I'm gonna go to my science class. Like, things are like down in. And if I was in classes with Heather and like they were kind of playing this very gentle, I found, game of pushing back on students and their more radical ideologies. And of course, I went to Everett College, very radical people there, very openly radical people.
So were you actually there when the whole thing blew?
I was, yeah.
Okay.
I was.
Wow.
At that point, I wasn't in courses with Brett, and Heather was on sabbatical, so I was a little bit more peripheral to the drama. So I watched it a little bit from the outside and I was, I was living with people who were protesting like situation. Anyways, that's like a whole long story.
Right.
But
Sure.
yeah, so your question about the grammar. So I think that actually when I read hyperobjects, that was really something that hit me in a really deep way, partially due to the environmental aspect of it. There was something just so beautiful about the reimagining of nature and the kind of poetic elements of that book, in terms of embracing this idea of withdrawnness, the withdrawnness of objects, and this kind of like inherent strangeness or uncanniness to being, and this being mixed with kind of environmentalism, or like a reemergence or a re-understanding of like how to engage with the hyper objects of Earth. Just like, I mean, I read that book like 7 times. Like it was just like such a critical text for me, in terms of like shifting my thinking and just being very like the grammar of my, like in terms of thinking of objects, of interacting with objects in the world and being like, oh, objects are like inherently imperceptible. I am inherently imperceptible. And anytime that I'm getting a contact with another object, I am coming into a kind of phase space where I'm touching an aspect of the object, but I'm not touching its inherent like wholeness.
Right.
But its wholeness is withdrawn, even to the object itself. And because of that, like the mix of the aesthetic, and it already like was, it was so interesting how I got into philosophy. It was very much environmental. Like I remember reading about people who were like against invasive species as a concept, like that kind of thing. And then eventually I just, I found that there were things about environmentalism that were emotionally manipulative. I found, and I think that as I've done more work on my kind of like more trauma-informed work on myself as a person, realizing that there is an unnecessary need to negate your own kind of psychological structure when trying to engage with things that you think are happening in material reality, right? And because of the instability of that framework, like, oh, the water's deep, like no water, and like you're gonna die, and like everything's gonna end, like that type of thinking is like highly unstable. And I think that for me, I had to distance myself from it. So my mother actually passed away when I was 19.
Wow.
And that was like a major shift in my life, that like completely reoriented like the gravitational kind of structure of my existence, because she was just the biggest center. Everything revolved around her, like everyone in the family, the whole lives revolved around her. And then she was like this whole, and she also held this kind of metaphysics. She's a very spiritual person. And as I got older and I started to distance myself from that and realize how much of that mentality for her was also rooted in her trauma, her history, I was like, okay, like I need to go figure out what I believe and individuate kind of fully from the fear, essentially the fear that was in my childhood environment. And so I feel very sympathetic towards the generation of kids today who are growing up, who are extremely anxious, feel like the pressure of the entire world is on their shoulders. They think that, climate change is just this like intractable problem that no one can do anything about. And it's just an overwhelming state for a young person to be in. It's very, very highly demoralizing. And I think in that time, and I think also the stuff that I found listening to Emerge and getting more interested explicitly in psychology was realizing like, okay, actually the psyche, you have to understand the structure of the psyche. You have to understand how human beings work in order to try and understand the objective state of things in the world. if you don't understand, and this is the rationality thing, if you don't understand biases, if you don't understand like the patterns of reality distortion that can emerge, or the confusion that we can exist in, and shared confusion, shared state of confusion, and then, you know, learning about propaganda, learning about the structure of institutions, and realizing that, oh wow, like the things that I believed, or the things that I was kind of primed to understand in the grammar of my upbringing, were also things that were propaganda, linked to propaganda campaigns, and you know, niche academic fields that became like utilized and weaponized in order to enter into kind of control societies, and you know, all of this kind of stuff, the deconstruction and critique. I did take that from postmodernism, but I was using it, and I continue to use it to critique postmodernism.
Right.
So
that's what a glorious thing. You mean that psychology is crucial in relationship to this? You come to the right program.
Crazy. Yeah, what a crazy idea. And like understanding my own psyche was really important. Yeah, like I said, just for negating like my own belief system, and being like, oh yeah, okay, well, there is some sort of objective thing going on. There is an objective kind of climate shift. There's an objective collapse scenario, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be a depressed, anxious person, right? Like these are actually separate qualities of existence. And I mean, I think, you know, obviously there's some crew in our world that's into that, like the doomer optimism people, right? So people have realized this, and I think that led me more into kind of, you know, consciousness studies and thinking about the structure of the psyche and our emotional selves, and healing traumatic experiences, and understanding the necessity to create a extremely high functioning social group in order to even begin to think about these like long-term intractable kind of like hyper objective collective problems. And so that kind of shifted my interest more into self-development and being involved in these communities where this stuff has become explicit and conscious, and people are working on themselves, because that's, I think, very much a necessary thing before you can be in a healthy relationship with yourself, the knowledge of what's going on in the world, and then actually act in a way that is contributing to some greater future, rather than just continuing to cycle in like stress and anxiety and traumatic experience. So, wow, I don't even
Beautiful.
know
Okay,
what your question is.
well, Mike, actually, that just resonates with a whole bunch of different things. So I'll offer some reflections. So, you know, from what I'm hearing is you're waking up to the grammar of a particular type of structure that you're built in. That's this in this modern, postmodern, you know, context. Say environmental activism's, you know, a very crucial critique, but then it's also, wait a minute, that gets propagandized. Wait a minute, what is the intersection of my own subjective conscious experience of being in relationship to these processes? Where are we, and what's actually necessary for the transformations that are healthy? And then, you know, it's particularly endearing to me, quite frankly, at the time that I am at in relationship to some of the more recent developments in UTOK, which happens to be over the last year in general, and over the last 2 months in particular, it is mastery of the concept of psyche inside of UTOK. Okay, so you like, if I actually need to do this, I'll go back to my first book, New Unified Theory of Psychology. I am not sure I would have used the word psyche ever in the book in relationship to that concept. And for a whole host of interesting reasons as to why and what that is. And it relates to the conceptual thing called the problem of psychology, which is the difficulty in grasping the subject matter of psychology in a way that is contextually framed by the language game of modern empirical natural science. Okay. And there's this whole network of problems, arcane academic conceptual problems that I'm actually epicentrally connected to. And the answer that I then generate is a behavioral answer in essence, which is, because it has to be from a natural science perspective, is a third person position in also what's called a nomenthetic position, which is a general lawful behavioral process. If you're going to anchor to the language game in natural science, you essentially need to play with that grammar. Okay.
Yeah.
And that means the subjective quality, idiographic experience of being in the real here now contingent experience is actually blinded by the language game of science.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The actual language game of science essentially tries to collapse in so that that subjective quality perspective is actually epiphenomenal or no longer necessary in relationship to the explanatory structure. And one of the great problems of psychology has been, is that the epicenter of our concern, the first person experience of being, okay? And what is the relationship between that and the language of natural science? And that's never been solved. UTOK solves it by framing this big picture behavioral view at the life level, and then the animal mental level, and then the human person level, generates a meta-theoretical structure for what's called human mental behavior, okay? That is then designed to give me as a psychological doctor a framework that's up to the task of my patient, okay? In other words, I now understand human mental behavior so I can hear you, see your human mental behavior. And now I've specified that I can wrap the human mental behavior around from the outside, the psyche from the inside. Okay? And so what UTOK then actually affords is a third person, first person, intersubjective, constructed, interpersonal, transjective epistemology that is coherent at the ontological level. So it bridges psyche and physics with coherence. And that's helpful. And
tremendously so.
It affords a particular kind of intelligibility then that we've been lacking. So that you pick up, so to me, the excitement in listening to your incredible capacity to kind of abstract across grammar, look at a multiplicity of different elements, find yourself in a particular thing, see post-conventionally above it, and then extract what it is that we actually need, and then to land yourself on psyche in relationship to hyper objects is a beautiful thing for me to hear, because I was like, yeah, intuitively, that's exactly the kind of grammar we need. And actually, UTOK is actually situated to bring coherent intelligibility to precisely those concerns.
Very cool. That's really interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a grammatical whole, right? So you would imagine that many people are kind of finding themselves attempting to bridge the gap or the whole, and maybe that's part of what people are feeling. And I think it's interesting. There's also this kind of quality of presence and absence, I feel, in terms of like engaging in the world. I mean, I think that Jung has a good idea in terms of the unconscious, but I think that there's maybe a more broader thing where there's like presence and there's absence, and absence is like a kind, it actually has a kind of gravitational quality to it, maybe even more so than presence does. But you have to be attuned to the things that are missing, and that takes a certain quality of sensing, truly like sensing. It's not just an intellectual thing, but it's more of there's a dispositional quality to it. There's like an openness, honestly, to like kind of rewriting your entire framework of interfacing with the world, which, like, luckily for me, I think I've just been highly malleable, and I've changed the way that I think like so many times. It's like insane.
I'll put a positive spin on malleable. You're highly evolvable.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. If I'm going through some sort of like,
why don't we put that? Like, yeah. Why don't we afford that? Without being hierarchical, we'll just say you're highly evolvable in relation. Okay.
Doesn't have to be hierarchical, I guess.
Well, we got to be careful about hierarchy, because that creates a positivity that then misses a negativity. We have to actually hold the dialectic. And indeed, I appreciate like Cadell Last and Bard's work on the negative negatology. Did I actually say that?
Yeah,
right? I think
so. Which is
I haven't
funny.
said it out loud yet, because I read it on intellectual deep web. I was like, how do I say that now?
Negatology. There's negging, so it's interesting that that's in the term negatology. Well, yeah, and then I think also this kind of got sucked into my thinking because Brett, as a conceptual, like as a evolutionary theorist, right? Like he would do these presentations about like adaptive landscapes and
Yep,
like how organisms, depending on what kind of path they're taking in terms of their evolutionary trajectory, end up with these like kind of stuck in these local maximums in terms of their evolvability. And so when you see these climate shifts, or you see these kind of the planet goes through these changes, there's some creatures that they have a path of adaptability that is not accessible to other creatures because they've picked their path and they don't have any.
Yep.
They don't have anywhere to go, essentially.
Right. You basically get a niche island that doesn't have the capacity to drop underneath it and find another island, and basically get starved out.
Yeah. And human beings, of course, are unique because of our capacity to kind of, fill up an adaptive landscape completely, but then also realize, oh shit, like this is no longer working. Can I walk back down the mountain, get into the valley again, and search for another peak to climb? And I think that metaphorical structure also gave me a kind of, metaphor, I think, or analogy, right? It kind of primes the mind to think in terms of space, right? And space is what gives you a sense of grammar. How are things arranged in space? Which is another, like, I also read Metaphors We Live By, and like kind of was learning about all of that stuff. So that's been my like intellectual journey.
Beautiful. That's very rich. And then you find yourself at the Stoa, and you find yourself, offering certain kinds of frames of reference and a particular identity. I also want to like begin to wander into some of our potential topics, although I'm having a hell of a time. So whatever.
I do have a link there, because I think the other piece here is like, at this time in my life, I was still pretty like masculinely oriented, like in terms of like even the patterns of my thinking, hyper fixated, like couldn't talk to people really about things besides what I was interested in, like just very obsessive.
Is that a problem?
I don't know that
that's the other people have to.
But there's a kind of it's something that I think is not particularly feminine. It's not a feminine kind of characteristic, because it was like I was coming into environments and I was asserting myself. I was like, if you're going to talk to me, I can only talk about these things. And if you want to talk about anything else, I will get bored and I will leave. That was like my problem.
No, that is a very, we could talk a little bit about archetypal masculine and feminine relational field dynamics. And you are describing an archetypal masculine relational field dynamic for sure.
Yes. And, this, I found lots of people who were cool with that to some extent, but I found, particularly in my female relationships, there was a lot less patience for that. And it was an interesting power to have, I think, also fused with like a young female body, was kind of put me in this unique position of this kind of like masculine and like physically female presence that gave me a kind of unique power, honestly, a unique power in social spaces. But I think eventually I started to realize that this was limiting to me in a way that I hadn't realized before. And I started to be interested in embodiment and like femininity more explicitly. And that was like the path I was kind of on. Before COVID hit, I was starting to realize that I was not in touch with my kind of caring nature, or I wasn't really engaged in practices of receptivity. I was a very dominant kind of person. It's just this very masculine kind of way of being in the world. And so I was trying to make a turn, but really it was like steering a massive ship. It's like, okay, I have to like like start really orienting, but I still have a long way to go, and I still feel like I'm on that path now. But then this is also coming in at the same time. I mean, that's kind of how these things go, right? There's like structural shifts, and then there's these insights that are symptomatic of the structural reorientation. Becoming more conscious of like my like kind of traumatic patterns, like the fact that I was not behaving in a way that was serving my long-term health and goals, was kind of spinning around and like couldn't sustain higher levels of responsibility and structure. And I was very much raised, I mean, I explained, to take on a great deal of responsibility and to be achieving very highly. And there was a lot of expectations in my household from my mother in particular, not only to achieve like academically and professionally, but also spiritually, like spiritually in terms of like, you know, sacrificing my life to some sort of mission or cause that would serve the world. And the pressure of this, I had mostly just like, after she died, I had just kind of pushed it away and denied it. And then it started to kind of come up. And after a couple psychedelic experiences, I came in deep contact with this. And I was like, oh my God, I have so much shame about the fact that I'm like not, you know, doing things for the world and like this whole thing. And that started to actually work on some sort of deeper level that made me more in contact with my femininity, in fact, strangely enough. And the thing that I'm working through now is really tapping into my capacity for care, which I had never even consciously thought about. I had not thought about being a caring person, being somebody who people want care from. People who feel safe with me, like all of these qualities that were in my relationships, but I was not consciously aware of. And that was, I think, mostly due to this kind of masculine orientation in the world, where I was like, well, I have these interests and I'm solving these conceptual problems. And like, yes, I'm in relationship with you, but like, the things that you want from me are not in alignment with the things that I'm studying and I'm interested in. And like, there was these conflicts that were arising, kind of the same ones over and over and over again, around this negativity, this negative space of like the care that I was giving, but unconsciously giving, and not able to interact within a conscious way in my relationships. And at some point, this, like, you know, after, you know, psychedelics and all sorts of like self-work, and, you know, I think AJ Bond actually at the Stoa with shame brought shame into a conceptual space for me, that I was like, oh, holy shit, like there's this huge hole. Oh my God, like where did that come from? So I think that now, and after, and even like listening to your conversation with Fanny Norland, about the feminine and the connection to the void, and actually taking on conceptual, intellectual interest in what it means to be a woman. And the way that I think about this is that there are kind of sensing potentials in bodies, right? There's like paths that you can go down, like propensities that you might have in your sensory experience, that if you tap into those things, you might find a peak that's extremely high, right? And I have a pretty high peak in terms of my masculine orientations, and so I think that that's where I naturally was inclined to go. But I hit some kind of ceiling, and I needed to get kind of knocked a few times in order to kind of come down. And for whatever reason, in terms of the timing, I was in a valley at a time where I was becoming conscious of this new peak, which was this feminine capacity for sensing and receptivity that I hadn't been conscious of, but I had been doing. I
Right,
had
right.
been totally receptive of other people.
Mhm.
I could totally appeal to them personally, hyper personally, like
Mm.
get into places with people that they didn't get into places with other people, like
Mhm.
just this kind of unique capacity to receive others, but
Mm.
completely unconscious. Like, I did not know what I was doing. And now I'm like, oh, this is actually like a feminine capacity, and it can be trained, it can be developed, and it's also crucial. It's highly crucial for doing healing work and for even receiving larger things like receiving the world and receiving like almost kind of navigational messages, right? Like that's when you start to get into like what is the unconscious and like how can you connect to it, and are women closer to it than men, kind of on a structural level because of the differences in our brains and like and our bodies. And I'm like, okay, wow, like maybe I should polarize myself, right? Like I thought of myself more of as an androgen and a go-between between these two polarities, but
Yep.
I'm realizing now, oh, I could really develop this other feminine polarity much more consciously. And that actually, I think that peak is very, very high for me.
Right.
So that's been like the kind of path that I've been going on now.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. No, that's I mean, just so for myself, I have my feminine therapist heart, right?
Yes.
And then I have my physicist head, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and there is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely well, yeah, so I'm not, I am, and I'm more archetypally masculine, but I have a deep feminine heart in a particular way. And it is certainly structured to cultivate a healthy and strong opponent process that is complementary in relationship to analytical, instrumental, tough-minded problem solving that needs to be focused. And oh my God, what are you telling me? And let's talk.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, so your narrative there just that falls into my psyche and really and resonates deeply, and I can feel that in you, and it's so cool to then see your potential then being realized as sort of, oh, I'm neither. It's like, no, I'm actually both, and in a potentially rich and powerful way.
Yeah, totally. And I think also my like masculine propensities, capacity to focus, all of that will be served so well by connecting to this feminine receptivity and heart connection to the world. And I mean, and it's amazing. I don't know, how much are you like into and or adopt like kind of Keegan models of adult development?
I can certainly track the Keegan model of
You
the
can
self and
tango with
relation.
that. Yeah.
I'm generally decent on these kinds of things.
Oh, I know, but I mean, I don't know how like much you like, adopt that structural idea. But I do think that I whether or not you adopt his model wholeheartedly, the idea of subject-object shifts as you kind of go through adult development, I think, is crucial as a metaphor for understanding the orientation that happens with the psyche. And in terms of like identity formation and where you center yourself. And I think I've just gone through this subject object shift. And mostly it's been catalyzed by this connection to the heart and to the feminine. And my ability to sense social phenomenon, the unspoken, like the unconscious, like the things that are like not being said or not being like explicitly communicated, but are in the space, skyrocketed. It was insane how much more attuned I could be to social environments, and like how much more overwhelming they became. In some sense, like, go to the grocery store, you're like, oh my God, like there's so much going on here.
The shadow backdrop of negative energy in the relation to this space is very strong.
I'm like, oh, I really want to go to the like bougie sparse grocery store now because I can just like feel like the intensity of going to like Fred Meyer. It's just like the chaos and like it's whatever, the hostile architecture, like all of these things. I think, yeah, and I mean I have ideas about this in terms of if you cultivate feminine and sensitivity to the world, you need to have, you either need to just sequester yourself from harsh, like masculine environments or hostile environments, because they actually, they damage your receptivity and your softness, or you have to be able to put on armor. You have to have like spiritual boundaries that you're able to walk into when you leave your house, or you leave your your sequestered place, in order to deal with the extreme hostility of living in a society. I mean, especially like American culture is like, there's so much antagonism just like everywhere. And the internet is this whole other world of antagonism and emotional tensions and repression that gets exposed. And I think that also, I've become much more attuned to that, like the implicit kind of emotional communication and the emotional energy that's being transferred in symbols. If you're online and you're reading something from someone, you can feel like, oh wow, this person's pissed, right? And you like receive that feeling, and you have it inside of yourself. So it's made me a lot more aware of people in psychoanalysis, and I think probably there's lots of frameworks pointing at this. The fact that we have transference, the fact that we like pick up on the emotional context of other people without even consciously being aware of it, and you can be aware of it. And this is something that's fascinating to me. And the change in my psyche has made me feel like so much more humbled in terms of, I mean, I'm 26. I'm going to be 27 in April. I'm like, oh my God, if my psyche could change so much at such a young age, like I can't even imagine what's going to happen when I'm like 40 or 50 or 80, you know, just like
make it stop. I don't know.
Holy crap. Like it's like this. And yeah, I mean, I'm just baffled. I'm baffled by the potential of consciousness shift with a restructuring of your subjective nature, and how it actually attunes you to different forms of implicit kind of communication or energy or whatever you want to say in the field, you know, in the social field. And I think cultural sophistication, in fact, this is one of my theories, I guess, cultural sophistication is actually the kind of development of these traits in a community, and the capacity to form etiquette that everyone shares that allows them to play with the implicit dynamics that are occurring in their social environment. Yeah, and I think we've kind of lost that grammar. Like that's a grammar of interaction and a grammar of understanding about what is invisible or what is not explicitly pointed to. And I think Western frameworks of understanding things have kind of obfuscated these dynamics and pushed them into the shadow. And we've actually lost cultural grammar for engaging with these things. And with the emergence of the digital communication medium, now all of that shadowy, repressed kind of qualities are being brought into the forefront, into our social environments, and we literally don't have the words to describe what's going on. We don't have the models to describe what's going on, and so many people are being flung into it all at the same time, that I feel like there's you can feel the gap, like it's palpable, the absence of grammar, and the fact that we're actually kind of losing the grammar that we did have even more, kind of like rushing to zero. Patrick Ryan talked about this in an episode that we were doing on arrows. So anyways, I'm just rambling, but I feel your feminine receptivity.
I'm loving this. My receptivity is very high at this juncture. You're filling me up with all sorts of insights.
Oh, man, yeah, no, it's great. So it feels really good. Yeah, it's not often that I get the chance to just like say everything all at once. So I appreciate that context and frame. That's the form of magic, right? Setting the context, setting the frame, so that you can expose all these things. But I'll throw the ball back to you. Where do you want to take it?
Well, I'm listening and absorbing simply because you're filling in a number of abstract gaps, at least in relationship to the systems that I am seeing in the hyper objects that we live, and you're picking up massive themes and you're filling them in with some degree of, specifics, as well as an intuitive felt sense of being that seems exactly right for the moments that we're in. So, sign me up.
Is how can I make a vocation of this? This is my big question.
There you go. Well, that is a good question. But I do believe, at the level of, what we're trying to do is we are searching for awareness about what the inadequacies of the current grammar are. Okay.
Yeah.
And then we are trying to emerge a particular grammar that does capture us as we implode to zero and finds its way, acknowledging whatever momentum and inertia is going to carry us in a particular painful spot. But we want to actually also be operating in a way that's going to minimize the depth of that basement drop and do what we can to play a role in a networking structure that affords the rebirth of a new kind of grammar that's up to the task of this digital age. And ultimately, UTOK's fundamental concern is what is happening in the back half of the 21st century. That's like that rebooting a sustainable grammar that affords in Zach Stein's terms an educational intergenerational transmission of legitimate knowledge oriented toward wisdom as we relate to each other in the digital through our technological structures inside of nature with each other and our own chaotic fucking psyches.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Zach Stein work is really influential for me right now in terms of education and education reform, or imagining as the source of new cultural operating systems. That seems
right. That John Vervaeke used grammar. You're using grammar. It's not schooling. It's the fundamental backdrop of grounding architecture that we can actually come to agree on at some level that's going to transcend this unbelievably crazy spot. So we know what's going to be incredibly new and be open to it, but share our values together around the grounding of what necessitates our sustainability, and that's a foundational issue. And UTOK's got a particular angle on that because it basically says I actually can analytically diagnose the errors, the specific errors that emerge in the Enlightenment modernity set of understandings that break open our philosophy for coherent intelligibility and pummel us brutally into a chaotic fragmented pluralism that then is unable to then upgrade our grammar as we then swim in an ocean of information, only layering itself upon itself in the digital world and then creating this vacuum in which people get sucked into. But we have to then, from a sort of meta-psychological physician perspective, diagnose the error, fix the error conceptually. That's what UTOK affords. And then I have to figure out, find people to connect that are also seeing it and then create a participatory relation. So you actually, because it's really fucking complicated, but then make it as simple as possible and then afford that metabolization down the road so that that new grammar that's up to the task gets upgraded and emerges in the system so it catches the implosion and then reverberates and then affords a transition into hopefully a better state of being.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for your contributions. I feel like, it's interesting. It's interesting the idea of like getting people to understand it versus providing a clarified framework for people who already get it. Right. Like that's kind of, and I think that's the thing about emergence, right? It's like, it's all about the adjacent possible, right? And like kind of letting things spread through these networks of influence. And if you can, and I think you have, find people who, intuitively resonate with the structure. Like, I think for me sitting here, I'm like, oh, this is like clarifying things, right? In a way that I'm like, I could use this as a model. And I could imagine as well, doing therapeutic practice of any kind, if whether or not you're doing something like more mind body, like you're doing like naturopathy or treating illness, I mean, you can still use this kind of structure, right? Because we're talking about these different levels of emergence. Like when you're sitting with a physician and you're trying to tell them what's wrong with you, you know, you're using a justification layer in order to communicate, but like something that's going on physically in your body. And like we know that there are these loops between what's happening in the psyche and what's happening in the physical body, and the necessity to understand, you know, what is like the animal structure, you know, of our modalities, what's uniquely human, and how they interface with each other. You know, I think Benita Roy, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at her. She's got kind of her
Oh
own
yeah, no, I visit her stuff. She's coming on UTOK in March. Woohoo!
Cool.
Of course, me and Bonnie. Me and Bonnie have synced up around the nature of self and psyche, and you know, we're slightly at different, but now we actually hanging out for a little while. And
cool.
You know, my UTOK thing comes across as this sort of meta-systemic thing that Bonnie's like, but I was like, yeah, actually, no, I'll flip it around and do the therapeutic care thing, and then we can actually get along. It's good. And then we have, and you know, I think she's brilliant, and we're synergistically dancing these days, so that's good.
That's awesome. I love that. I mean, one of the things that she did in her Stoa session, where she was kind of laying out her model of the self, she talked about the animal, right, and how like we've basically created a grammar around our animal nature that makes the kind of, you know, like whatever base things about being an animal, like shitting and fucking and dying and being aggressive and like all of this stuff bad, and all of the good stuff about being an animal, like loyalty and love and nurture and care, all of these things that for mammals, like you see them and you see this in other animals. It's not a uniquely human thing to be loyal.
No. Or love.
Or love. Yeah, no, like these are qualities of other mammals, and I would even argue like some other I mean, like what's going on with birds? Like it seems like they have this kind of like long-term parental care.
Right.
And that was just like boom to me. Like I was like, oh, thank you for just pointing that out, because like that is so true, right? Like the animal nature has both these qualities that we venerate and we see as being like core of justice and character, loyalty, integrity, and all of these character qualities in a person. But then we also we toss away, we say that human is, but all of this aggression and all of this fear and all of this you know, all of this bodily stuff, right? That's all just like bad devil stuff, and we're just gonna like push that out and exile it. And I feel like that is, you know, kind of talking about the Dark Renaissance critique of B&B, for example. That's bringing that back into the, like our whole concept of what it means to be human as human animal, and integrating those aspects, I think, is a super critical part of reworking the grammar of our existence and becoming comfortable with our animal nature and the body as such. And like I'm experiencing that now with spending time with my grandmother who's dying. I'm like, her body is being it's deteriorating in front of me. I can see it, like it's being reduced to function, right? Which is very, you know, very much the Western medicine way of dealing with the body. But regardless of kind of the Western grammar of it, if you're in touch with the intergenerational, if you're in touch with the bodies of babies and the bodies of elders, you can see that there is this life cycle that we move through, and that the criticality of our physical bodies and how that is connected to health and like wellness and like wholeness, whatever words you want to use.
Those are all good ones.
And then how that relates to the psyche, because the other thing that I've been observing, you know, as my grandmother's aged, is how her psyche has just like rigidified. You know, and playing these long games in terms of your life and how you're adapting to change, and whether or not you're able to give up the structure of your identity and go into this, like, you know, chrysalis stage where you denature all of your structure and you go through like an annealing process and allow for a reemergence of a new structure of like neurological interaction with the world. all of these things are necessary skill sets for adapting to the liminal stage that we're in. And if we can preserve these journeys in an educational process, then it's something that we could actually use as the ground of an emerging community and an emerging culture.
Totally.
And that's the kind of thing that could create the possibility of a highly sophisticated culture of people who are operating in their animal bodies, and they know that they're using the powers of their animal bodies, the sensing of their animal body, and also bringing that into integrity with their justification structures. You know,
you talking now, girl.
That's right. I'm picking it up.
Right. So I'll give actually, so we can layer that up just a little bit here. So yes, you're an organism. Okay. So you're an organism, genes, cells, organ systems, your human biological, physiological structure. It's a complex adaptive system that then creates a field. Okay. Then you create a neurobiomental field. Okay. That first is a neurocognitive structure that's basically kind of robotic, but out of that pretty quickly, it ties together into the base of your psyche. Okay, so the psyche then refers to the epistemic organizing, meaning-making, experiencing system that is at the fundamental core of the thing I can't see, but the thing you see through. Okay, so that's the epistemological gap that I can't see, and your epistemological portal into the perspectival world. That's the epicenter of your psyche. Okay, now we can drop down. If you follow the psyche in terms of its basic constituents, what you'll feel is you'll find it, okay, there's sort of like a screen of awareness, all right? And then that screen of awareness will dissipate ultimately if you tend to it in a witness function that then dissipates into the body, okay? And then you get pleasure, pain, active, passive, what John Vervaeke and I call valence qualia, okay? So the valence qualia is the fundamental base of intersecting with the core of the animal mental into the organism living. All right. And basically, it's the collection of the body that's sending collective signals, like in a stadium, clapping or booing, okay, that then gets organized into pleasure and pain, active, passive. All right. So that's the base of your animal body. Then we jump up to your mammal. The mammal capacity extends that into a perceptual field and gives you an internal working memory system that is your inner mind's eye, that has adjectival and adverbial consciousness functions that allows you to extend across time and hold that picture screen and do a little bit of manipulation. Okay. So that's your inner mind's eye, and that's bouncing around all the time. You're like, oh, look at that. Look at that. Look at that. That's your mammal. Okay. Then you're a primate. Okay. And in particular, a hominid primate that's unbelievably relational. All right. What the relational primate does that we have, that other primates sort of have, but we pull together our attachment systems, our competitive systems, our cooperative systems, yoke them together into a self-other field that creates an intersubjective sense so that I can track you attention-wise and intention-wise better than the other great apes before I have language, okay? And you nod and I point and we're dancing together. Okay. And we can music together, right? We can image together. We have a shared sense, what Michael Tomasello calls we space. This is your primate heart. Okay. It's the felt sense of attachment, the felt sense of joining, the felt sense of feeling secure on the one hand, or fucking rejected and not belonging and brutalized on the other. Okay. So you got your animal body, your mind's eye mammal. Now you're into your primate heart. And those are the stacked animal systems of the psyche that we fucking wander around and need both the hostile, angry, shitting, fucking, and at the same time, the loving, cooperative care, which is all just part of the nature. And actually the human structure, especially on this, because of the flexibility of this influence matrix capacity, our capacity for good and evil in the relational world is unbelievable on both ends of that. Okay. And so we better be aware of that polarity and the tendencies and the opportunities that we have to both be one of the greatest animals, giving wise, one of the most fucking evil animals because of its flexibility. And then what happens is we then, sync up, we start tagging symbolically, and then we get these propositions, okay? Semantic syntactic propositions. And it is the negative space of propositions that actually launches the whole fucking problem, according to unified theory. So you start saying, there are the antelope, okay? Where before we said antelope there, which we would intuitively be able to, sync up, we'd watch behavior, blah, blah, blah. We'd be doing animal communication. Well, now you get symbolic syntactical communication. You actually have an analytic truth statement. There are the antelope. Okay. And what that actually does cognitively is opens up the negative space of possibility around there are the antelope, which maybe they're not. Okay. Those aren't antelope. And it occupies a positive space that says, well, there are rabbits, maybe we should go hunt those. And there are berries, maybe we should go do that. Okay. Because it yokes us together around a truth claim and then opens up possible negative space about factual and then investment dynamics. I'm good at hunting antelope, so I want to talk there. You're good at hunting rabbits, you want to go over there. How do we then navigate what we're actually going to do in the possible space relative to the positive space that the proposition activates? Okay. Well, that's then creates questions, what, when, why, where. Notice how simple those fucking questions are. Okay, which then open up negative possible space. And now you get question answer dynamics. Okay, which is around the problem of justification, which is legitimizing is and ought and coordinating ourselves and building shared propositional networks of belief systems that give us the same propositional reality that can then coordinate our implicit intersubjective reality. And that then becomes the culture person plane of existence, where now we're justifying explicitly, okay, our primate cells that we're trying to coordinate implicitly. All right. So then you actually, on top of that animal psyche, you then get a human head, which has a justificatory narrator. And because of the cognitive flexibility associated with justification, we can actually project ourselves in a time variable that's radically different than other animals too. So we get a perspectival projection across time and a justificatory, and that's your head up here, where you're like, oh, I'm going to fucking go to graduate school for 4 fucking years, right? You know, whatever. And it's like, who the hell, the animals really, other animals, okay? So now we sit in headspace, and then ultimately that arc of time, like then that becomes transcendent, spiritual kinds of stuff. So we need to help people realize that their psyche stack sits inside that body, and that body creates the entire container for it. And it regulates it in passive, active, pleasure, pain that creates a particular mammal field, creates a particular primate relational field, and then creates person heads cross-time image-wise and justificatory space-wise. And then ultimately, if we can align our transcendent spiritual arc across time with our embodiment, then we will actually be able to have a wisdom stack that's up to the task, constructing a grammar that's sustainable.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking of in terms of navigation is critical, right? Because especially as I get older and I'm trying to surf these longer time scales.
Right, easy there.
I know.
Remember who you're talking to. That's okay, exactly. I'm coping. And I'm still changing, as you know, as I told you right before.
Of course.
Things are still happening.
Of course. But, you know, and especially nowadays, oh my gosh, like, there's so many different bureaucracies to navigate and financial systems. Like there's so much structure that exists that you need these like higher level faculties to be able to move through them with any form of sophistication. And the navigation of time. And I mean, it's truly a form of wisdom, I think, not just merely be reactive to circumstance, but to actually be able to work with the signs to make decisions that push you in a place where you want to be in the future at the time that you want to be there, rather than being there just a fraction too late, you know? And which is, I mean, obviously critical for us as we move through this liminal time. And like, it's hard to achieve that in your own individual life, but imagining a whole tribe, you know, finding a way to orient themselves collectively in a navigational space, it's a task that's quite monumental and requires each of those individuals to do all of this integration work that you're speaking to. Yeah,
the pessimistic framing I offer is that we're fleas on a Titanic, but you know,
it's true.
You know, that's like, you know, that's so yeah. If you want to stack the deck in the way that's like, hey, is this going to be possible? Could fleas turn the Titanic? I don't know, but on my more optimistic,
like jump at the same time.
They all jump. You know what else? And what else? What else are we gonna do? We can at least hope and hop.
Yeah, exactly. True. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that this is where I'm curious about what it could potentially be to tap into the feminine. I don't know if you've read any like tantric texts or anything like that. I'm not
Say
like
that again. I didn't hear that.
tantric.
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm not well developed in the tantric world. I'll put it that way. But.
Me neither. But it's the kind of thing that, you know, sometimes you hear about something and then you kind of.
Yeah, actually, I've been ever since I've been on Bard's list. I've been wondering about, hey, I should probably upgrade my tantric capacity.
What's up with that?
Yeah, it's like I'm definitely on
like,
that. We're in the same.
Like, well, should I get closer to this thing? What's going on? But I think there's like a framework of masculinity and femininity that I've kind of learned indirectly through other people talking to me about it. So this is very much grapevine situation, but. And even Fanny talked about this in her conversation with you of like the feminine being this kind of oracle that stands on the edge of the void and like speaks kind of this, Bard talked about this too, this metaphorical, poetic language that is given to the masculine. And you know, in Bard's mentality, this is like a split phallus to the chief and to the priest to connect them to the navigational field that the feminine is kind of in contact with, and allow for them to articulate that actively into the world through this cooperation between the polarities of the masculine. Totally. And you know, it's the kind of thing where I'm curious about whether or not that is the case. Like, is it the case that like there's all these like tropes about women and like being hysterical and like being kind of mentally ill and like all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, you know, is this actually a way of framing this capacity of the feminine as a pathology and not holding a structure in the culture and in relationship between the masculine and feminine polarities, where the capacity for connection to this maybe more oracular kind of long time weird kind of singularity thing going on, where I mean, especially if you're a woman who's been operating kind of like as a midwife or a priestess of some kind, where you have this contact with bodies of others and you're receiving them constantly, like the way that information is brought into you is not linear systematic. It's through this kind of like impressions and receptivity that maps it into this like different kind of associative field. And it feels like there's some potential for women to cultivate this capacity to stand in this like associative wisdom and offer that to the masculine for their more kind of detail oriented kind of structural navigation through kind of objective depersonalized systems, right?
Totally. I mean, the ease with which I can sink into that mythopoetic archetype is striking to me. I'll put it that way. And certainly I am the masculine priest. Okay. So, and my task fundamentally is to analyze and then bring back, you know, and really wanting to bring back to the feminine, let me solve the analytical problems and bring back to you. And you do, you know, you reward me, and then you do see fit with what that it is, the gifts that I bring back. And I'll create a particular kind of architecture that you then live in a more chaotic and intuitive way. And my job is to afford that, and then to watch the receptivity and the cyclical flourishing in an intuition around a pristine architecture that I built that I'm rewarded for. That's a very, very pleasant opponent process for me. You know, I can really, and I want to play that role as an archetypal masculine. It's like I can feel very, it's a really interesting position, because look at what I do here. It's like I do this, okay, Notice the position, right?
Yeah.
Like and as opposed to this, it's like I want to cherish, hold, and honor, okay, and bring my gifts back so that you then utilize them and evaluate them in terms of their usefulness, and then reward accordingly, with sexual gifts and all of, or whatever, admiration and all of that kind of thing. But it is to give them so that I cherish and honor and watch them be utilized to grow and replenish, and that feels very, very complementary. And so it's role-based. I mean, it's archetypal. Look, I'm going to go out and solve these problems analytically, but it's not in a way, well, because you couldn't. It's like, no, you're doing something fundamentally I can't. There's a regenerative connectedness to the cycle of being. And I'm going to take a linear particular angle and then bring back my linear thought to afford contribution to the cyclical process that you're engaged in. And that feels very sort of like archetypally yin yang to me, in a way that then engenders a whole that is the kind of processes that are, in some ways, it's archetypal masculine and feminine energies that then placed in proper relation to achieve healthy opponent process balance. And I think we miss that horribly in our culture. I mean, I think that what that's pretty dialectically opposed to, men and women are basically the same, we just bullshit what we are, through some social constructed justificatory narrative. There's no real animal essence there at all. That's just power hierarchies. This is actually, no, that's completely errant. The question is, how do we actually afford our justificatory roles to create healthy opponent processes? And why I'm archetypal, that doesn't mean that somebody else might be born in a different kind of body. There's all sorts of different reasons why we want to be unbelievably pluralistic, but we don't want to obliterate the opportunity for healthy opponent processes between the archetypal primate, masculine and feminine complementary systems that would then afford a particular type of network for our natures in a way that I think is regenerative. So that's what totally.
Yeah, well, because I think it's like circuits and energies. We're all seeking, energies in order to motivate us, and the kind of energy sink that you find yourself in is going to be part of how you navigate, how you're intuitively moving through the field. And without this polarity that can cycle, this energy between the masculine and the feminine, and between men and women, truly men and women who are standing in their bodies as themselves in this kind of this emergent and integrated way, I think that, of course, we're going to be lost. I don't understand. Like, pretty much everybody has moved over to the masculine side, right? And so we have a highly asymmetrical culture, and I don't see how that will have a long-term, I just don't see the long-term.
No, it's disastrous. That's why I wanted to talk to you and Femi, and there's Fanny and Adriana, and there's lots of reasons to talk to women about gender stuff, but to awaken the appreciation of the feminine archetype's power and the centrality that it blows in sustainable culture in terms of cultivating the grammar, and the fact that we've obliterated that through so much of what modernity did, and really pre-modernity. I mean, it's really, you got to go back oral indigenous, not to be sort of stereotypical. I fundamentally believe that's true, to look at many systems that have a proper relation. And so there's a lot of remembering we need to do in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been, as I've been connecting to this care capacity and being with my grandmother, also kind of checking into my biological urge to have a child. There's it seems like, my folk theory about this is that women, as they go through puberty and adulthood, they have these kind of moments where they want to deepen their capacity for care. And it often comes as an object in the mind, like an image of oh, I want a baby, right? Or, oh, I want something like that. Or I'm, really need, I need a dog, or I need a plant, I need to put this energy into something. Sure. That's not, I think actually many women and many men get into these dynamics where women are infantilizing their partners because they need some care object. It creates this natural asymmetry of power, because the woman needs a dependent, which that's like the particular kind of quality of that care energy, which is why I think a dog is like a better channel than a man, right? Like, because
for that kind of, agreed.
Women don't actually want like men who are infants. Like, that's just not
right. That's not the big turn on in the bedroom.
No, it's not. But they also want like the channel for their, their care capacities. And so these things are kind of getting conflated. And also women are delaying reproduction, and like, that's like not totally unusual. But I think that what is unusual is the kind of, the kind of pejorative or like kind of pushing away or devaluing of care jobs in general. Like, they're very low paid work. It's seen as being like kind of, I don't know, like disgusting, or like, to take care of like an elderly person. It's like, oh, why would you do that? You have to change the diapers. Like, that's so horrible. Like, you, and some parts of this, like, you do have to have a, like, truly a capacity for care in order to do these jobs effectively, and to play this role effectively. And the woman, I think, who embraces that and can actually do that type of work, is engaging with this, like, embodied experience with the human cycle through interaction, through this total receptivity to the care of another person. Like, the thing that I realized when I was taking care of my grandmother that week when we talked, was I had to let go. I had to dissolve my sense of operating in the world, because I am, I'm 26, I'm able-bodied, I'm like able to, I'm not aware of what it's like to be a 92-year-old woman. Like, and I can look at her from the outside and interact with her, but until I'm receptive to her perspective, I don't understand why she has objects placed in her house in certain places so she can grab onto them as she's moving from her chair to the kitchen. Like, I'm not necessarily tapped into how she's navigating from her vantage point, from the structure of her body, to move through the world. Same thing with the child. Like, unless you're able to kind of dissolve your way of interfacing, and really try and place yourself into their position in the world, you see them as an object from the outside, and you're not really aware of how they're intuitively engaging with the reality around them. And the really synthetic, and I think the sophisticated level of this is being able to hold your intelligence and your way of interfacing with the world and that other person's perspective, and find a way to then assist them moving through their own environment, right? And once you've done this with babies and, pregnant women, and with elderly people, or with people who have various disabilities or mental illnesses, like, suddenly you have a intuitive, receptive, like, memory and experiential knowledge of engaging with all of these different qualities and characteristics of what it means to inhabit a human body. And that knowledge to me is like, I'm like, oh my God, like, how incredible. Like, that is like a kind of, and like, in touchness with what it means to be human, that is so critical, like, so deeply critical. All
right, I got to pause you right there. That's absolutely fucking brilliant. Okay, so I gave up my clinical license this past year. There are a lot of reasons to it. Okay, some complicated, whatever. But one of the identity reasons was that the cloistered intelligence of psychotherapy, and the professionalization of psychotherapy needs to be undone in a particular way, and it needs to be, the fundamental wisdom of the process of psychotherapy needs to be released back into the world. Okay, And if we go back and hit the clip of what you just described, okay, you essentially described the relational process wisdom of psychotherapy.
Yes.
Okay.
Totally.
The process by which you hold the psyche. In other words, you stay in your place and you understand what the world is from whatever third person and your particular transferential perspective in the world. But then you actually enter into an intersubjective field where you flip into the empathy of what it is like for your grandmother to grab hold of a particular place inside her embodied psyche, and then be with that while you also maintain your perspective and maintain a potential third person view, and to intersect between those types of things with grace and consistency and honor of the various perspectives in some sort of healthy opponent process. Okay. And to be able to do that regularly across contexts, across diverse individuals that are across the lifespan, and to live in a world where we would have individuals regularly afforded that capacity with each other, well, that's a different kind of grammatical world.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
Okay. So
Absolutely.
yeah, you just, the elegance with which you articulated that was striking to me.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's just, the impression that I got just being around my grandmother. I was just like, holy crap, like, whoa, what, oh my God, what a loss that we're not living intergenerationally. What a loss. Like, just the fact of spending that time with her and being conscientious, like actually being in a receptive state where I'm trying to and I'm putting in a kind of open effort. Right? I'm not like trying to get her. I'm like receiving her through an openness and through a letting go of my own identity. How much knowledge I got. It was just like, and not like particular knowledge like about how to do any particular thing, but like perspective on the world. And I think that's so much of our cultural conflict, I feel like, is people who have various, because we're highly specialized, right? We're kind of all stratified and we're all siloed and separated from each other. People just yelling at each other, being like, my perspective is valid. My perspective is valid. Like, can't you see my perspective? And it's, I can see why people who work with people with disabilities or with elders or with children are like so frustrated. That for most of the rest of the world, these are totally marginalized populations. They're pushed out to the very edges. They are hidden. They are put in these facilities that are far away, and most people are not developing a capacity to intelligently and respectfully and to what's possible from living in relationship to people who are in different phases of their life cycle, and it's I think I wonder about the gendered aspect of this, because if there is gender polarity, and I think that there is, and if there is like this kind of sensory potential that I was talking about in terms of like the men and women, and like, I mean, we know this, like, women have better sense of smell or like see more colors or whatever. Like, there's actual kind of grounded physical things that make us different in terms of how we perceive reality on a sensory basis. So why wouldn't that continue up the hierarchy of your system? Why wouldn't that continue to be true as you move through and include all of these different aspects of the whole experience of being human? And what does it mean for women to be giving up this kind of experiential knowledge, and also for it to be kind of put down as a form of unpleasant labor that people don't really want to do. So it's, yeah, I'm just like processing all of that and thinking about it myself, and like how I don't think that I can replace that experiential knowledge with reading a book or
propositional knowledge. Totally different. So
yeah, I just can't do that. And so, and this is a navigational thing too. And I think that's where perspective comes in. It's like, because my perspective has been reoriented, my sense of navigation in the world is shifting. And like what I should be making contact with, and how individual people, what they come in contact with, like is truly critical, right? Like, and being kind of androgynous, like you're kind of talking about your own androgyny, right? Like being like, okay, well, I'm going to have a life of service. I'm going to help people. I'm going to heal people. I'm going to like give up my own kind of sense of identity, and develop this quality of receptivity and care, and expand my heart and be capable of taking on all of these different perspectives. But I also have this capacity for propositional knowing, and I can articulate things, and I can communicate, and I can build systems, you know, and I can work between all of these different environments. Like all of that is a situational kind of identification where you realize, oh, I'm in this landscape, right? And I'm in a particular position. And if I can tap into forms of experiential knowledge that will give me an intuitive sense of how to be in the world alongside these other qualities that I just happen to have, then over time, those things will synthesize and will kind of open up new vistas that at this point, at this place where I am now, I can only see the, you know, budding kind of.
So my sense, Raven, is that your developmental structure on your self-object change across a number of Keegan arcs is going to be brilliant over the next 26 years.
Wow, thank you. I know this. Maybe this is like a interview / like therapy life coach session.
It's a conversation, right, between two metamodern freaks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so
I don't know.
We should probably, we'll begin to wrap us up here in terms
okay, yeah, I was going to say, take the wheel here.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's basically the whole frame of UTOKing, Gregg, is just, you know, it's a tour of somebody's version of reality, and you've offered a brilliant and beautiful tour, and I appreciate that. Is there anything that you sort of like, you know, kind of definitely wanted to touch on, or if you look out in the horizon, you want to sort of perhaps leave people with? I mean, I think you've, you know, it's kind of been a free form, which I really like. I think we touched on a wide variety of different fascinating things for folks. But I want to give you an opportunity to see if there's anything as we begin to wrap up that you want to share as the horizon approaches here.
Yeah. Well, I do think that the ground for working through these things is present in any relationship, particularly the relationships between the sexes. And there is a deep necessity for those bonds to be repaired. And they're, even in the most kind and like, you know, loving relationships, there are still these I would say kind of like cultural grammars that have been inherited that people are carrying around, that it's only through experience with another person who isn't holding that as a form of truth that you can really begin to believe that there's other ways that are, there are other forms of engagement that are possible. And I mean, I think that that's been critical for me is like learning to trust my own navigation in the world, and not like, it's interesting because you have to walk this line where you don't want to be too uncompromising, but you also want to make sure that you're staying in your center, because some people are going to want things from you. I mean, especially like young women, oh my God, it's just people want your attention so much. It's just this like intense like barrage of like people, and you know, the world is so porous, and like, you know, people just come up to you, or like they'll send you messages, or like whatever. It's just this like constant attention that you get thrown at you when you're young, and if you don't know how to wield it, and you don't know how to engage in a proper way, I mean, I think that there are all sorts of failure modes for young women. There's like taking all of it as much as you can because you want that validation and you want that energy. There's kind of becoming like treating it like maybe in a more masculine way, where you're like kind of engaging in these more disposable relationships. There's like being kind of like turned off by the whole thing, and like sequestering oneself from it. You know, there's like all of these different ways that I think women are coping with this situation. And most of them, at least in my life, I found that I haven't been particularly sophisticated in the way that I have managed these relational dynamics. And particularly if you really do have things to offer, people are going to want your attention. Like, that's just the way that it is. So learning how to truly engage with the masculine with true respect, I think something that's pretty common is for women to think that men don't really have feelings. And I essentially think it's a form of dehumanization, and an objectification of that's happening both ways between men and women. And the cycle of kind of casual dating, I think, basically doesn't ever really allow for you to contend with the reality of the other person, because you're only getting as far as like your projections will kind of hold. And then the moment that they start to kind of crack, you're like, I'm going to go and see somebody else. You don't fit what I want. Or
next.
Next. Yeah, next. And like, it's the, oh my God, the like opportunity cost of that in terms of like the development of the psyche, right? Because I think for me, I've never casually dated or anything like that, and I haven't used dating apps or anything. And instead, I've just like met people in the wild and engaged in relationship with them. And I think I've been so lucky that that's been my my process of being in relationship, because I've had to contend with the imperceptibility of other people and their eyes witnessing me and being like, and almost in a way, just like being like demanding of being seen. They're like, you have to see me. You have to see me. I'm here. Like, you care about me. I know that you do. And almost in a way that's like, honestly, kind of threatening. It's like, if you don't see me, I will leave you. And like, that is the kind of thing that can break denial. It can break justification systems that keep you out of touch with like the true consciousness of another person. And we all have blind spots. We all have things that we're, tiptoeing around in our own psyches in order to avoid these catalytic moments of coming to terms with our own, our own self-denial, or pride, or shame, whatever it is that we're kind of running away from. And it's these relationships where people are not willing to give up on you, but are also holding you to the standards that they hold for themselves, and are also willing to step away if they're not being treated the way that they know in their heart is dignified to them.
Right.
That is just like a perfect situation for massive transformation of character. And that process is to be invited into your life. Like, a relationship, I don't think is measured by its pleasantness, but rather its kind of structure in terms of its capacity to almost create, like in a Keegan sense, create the kind of problems that your existence, your being is like solving in relationship to others. And it's hard. It can be very demanding, especially if you have a lot of work to do in the beginning. But it's the kind of thing that, because of sex and because of intimacy, connecting all the way through the system that you're outlining, through down into like the very base elements of what it means to be a living thing, you are engaging with this kind of channel that reaches deep into the other person, and they are reaching into that with you, and that space is like so charged. It's so charged with all of the qualities of being human, particularly the animal ones and the negative animal ones. So we need to be engaging in these like sexual, social, romantic dynamics to get this participatory knowledge. and to continue to face it over and over again, that this is part of reality. And it's a crucial part of reality in a world that has exiled these things to the periphery and doesn't even have a grammar to understand them in a holistic manner. And so it's going to be rocky. Like, we don't have the language for it. We don't have the grammar for it. You have to kind of accept that, that we've lost this cultural knowledge, cultural transference. And, you know, who's to say that that the models of history are actually going to function in the epoch that we're moving into, and that potentially it was necessary to rupture these pre-existing forms and roles and structures. And yeah, we're going through this very chaotic transition, and a lot of people are getting sucked into very exaggerated failure modes, like you said, right? We just have such a broad capacity for failure because of our flexibility as creatures. So it's a hazardous environment. You're going to fail. You don't know what you're navigating or what you're doing. And being in relationship, true, genuine, like deep relationship with other people, I think is the way to get that embodied experience that can begin to make conscious these things that are kind of latent but not explicit and not being interacted with in an integrated way. So yeah, that's my take on like sex, I think, in relationships. And it's a difficult, I mean, gosh, I know just for experience, like how these things just come into the rivalrous dynamics. I just know.
They certainly can do that quickly. They certainly can do that quickly. Yeah, no,
yeah, that's
great.
That's what I would say about that. And it is all being towards death ultimately. And like, if you can be in relationship to death directly, if you can go and sit with your grandparent, if you can go and sit with a person who's passing on, have reverence for the cycles of life and awareness of where you're going, to kind of broaden that perception of reality. I think that can only deepen your relationship to your present moment. If you're being courageous about what that brings up in you. And so once again, this just brings in the animal of the courage and the loyalty to oneself and one's experience and others. So
beautiful. I think those are lovely reflections on the grammar of our psyche and sex and gender and death that we need to emerge in relationship to, as we try to find our way through this time between worlds. So I think those are exactly the kinds of themes that I hope folks can reflect on and maybe find their way toward.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And
such a joy. So fun. I knew this was going to be fun. So
good. Well, I'm glad it was, and it was
delivered.
Certainly enjoyable. And we riffed off lots of different things. So cool. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to posting this and sharing it with folks.
Yeah. Thank you. It was a joy.
Good. Go ahead. All right.